For this video, we will be learning how to make a very simple animation in Solidworks. This is something you can do in about 5 minutes. The subject of our animation is going to be a very simple 2-piston engine. If I turn the crankshaft on this engine, you can see the pistons moving up and down in the cylinder bores. Before I make the movie, what I think I'm going to do is actually make the engine block transparent. Now if I turn the crank, you can see how all the interconnecting parts work. We have the crankshaft connecting to the connecting rods and then connecting to the pistons. To make an animation, what we're going to do is make a motion study, and you might have noticed before that there's this extra tab down below at the bottom next to model that says motion study, and maybe you've never clicked on this. Now a lot of times if you click on this tab, what will happen is it disappears on you. To get this back, go up into the corner here on the restore button, click this once, which will make the window smaller, and click it a second time and it'll resize the window again to bring the tab back. Now to see what's underneath this tab, what we have to do is drag this bottom bar up. And that can be a little bit of a pain the first time you try to grab it. So I'm just going to drag this up to here, and I'll move this up just a little bit more. And what I see here is a duplicate of the feature tree up above. And not only do I see the feature tree, I see a whole new menu, and I also see a timeline running from left to right. This timeline will show you the length of your animation and where you are in the animation when it's actually running. Right now we see a vertical bar set on 0. We see a little bit of yellow here, indicating that our animation is only 0 seconds long. In other words, there is no animation yet. Now it seems when I brought up the motion study tab that the engine block became solid again, so I probably should have changed that to transparent after I brought up the motion study tab. So I will right click on the engine block in the feature tree once again, change that to change transparency, and now we see that at 0 seconds our engine block is going to be transparent. Now before I was manually turning the crank, but to make the animation we need to do something that will automatically turn the crank for us. To do that, what we want to do is add a motor that's going to drive the flywheel that's attached to the crank. In the menu here we have a motor icon, so we will click on that, bringing up a feature manager. And the type of motor we want is a rotary motor. Scrolling down, we have to select where the motor will be applied and what the direction of the motor is going to be. Clicking on the end face of the flywheel, we see what happens is 2 boxes get populated. The first box indicates the location of the motor, and the second one is going to determine the motor direction. So it's going to apply a direction to this circular object here. In this case, we can see that it's going counterclockwise, and if we toggle, we get it going in the clockwise direction. We will ignore this third box and continue scrolling down. And the type of motion we want, the default is constant speed, so it will always run at the same speed, and we will accept the default of 100 revolutions per minute. Click on the green check mark. What that has done for us is created a 5-second long movie. I guess that's the default when you first add a motor. And we see a little bar has extended here, so it's showing us that we're going to have a movie that's 5 seconds long applied to our engine assembly. We see the rotary motor here with a yellow bar all the way out to the 5-second line. And if we hit our play button here, these are like recorder controls. What happens is it applies the motor to the animation and we see the pistons moving up and down. We also saw that when we did that, I'll hit the green play button again, we have this bar moving along. This shows us where we are in the animation, going from 0 to 5 seconds. And then when we get to the end of the animation, it just stops. We can also manually grab this bar with our left mouse button and drag this back and forth to any place in the animation. Now if we want this animation to be longer, we can take this black bar that represents the entire engine assembly and drag this diamond here at the end. This is called a key point. We will just drag this diamond out to, say, the 10-second mark, and that will increase the length of our animation. And if I hit the green play button again, we see now that all of these yellow bars that represent the motion of each of the parts within the assembly stretch back out to the new length of the movie. So that's all there is to adding some motion to the engine, but we want to be a little more complicated than that. What I'd like to do for this animation is not only have the crankshaft turning and the pistons moving, but I would also like to see the engine turning in space at the same time, which is much more interesting to look at. And it turns out that there's a little wizard built into this tool that will help us do that. Before I do that, I want to make sure that the engine is in a position that I like for the starting position. So this is kind of up in the corner of my window a little bit too much, but I do like the orientation. So I'm just going to drag this off to the side a little bit here. So just panning my view and bringing the engine about to here. I want it to be in the center of my window as it's spinning around and running the crank at the same time. Now I'm going to go to the animation wizard, which has an icon that looks like a movie camera. So clicking on that, this brings up a little wizard showing us a little rotating object. And this has got some simple tools built into it, and the default is just to make an animation that's rotating the model. So we click on Next. The default is to rotate the model about the Y-axis. And it will rotate the model in a clockwise direction and do just one single rotation for the 10-second duration of our video. Then we'll go to Next again. The duration here is set for 10 seconds. And it says that it's going to start the video at the 10-second mark. We really want to start at the 0-second mark. So if this says 10, change that back to 0. So this will start at 0 and play for 10 seconds. We now say Finish. And what we want to do is click on this Calculate button, which will recalculate the motion of the motor. Whenever in doubt, always click on this Calculate button if you've made any kind of a change. So we'll click on Calculate, and now we see it's rerunning through the animation. It's spinning the motor in space, and the pistons are going up and down at the same time. So we see it's added a new bar here under Orientation and Camera Views. We also see that it's added this diamond with a slash. So right-click on that and just uncheck Disable Key View Creation. And we see that with this heavy line here under Orientation and Camera Views, it's added several diamonds. What this has done is placed a camera in different positions around our motor. So drag this to different positions. And what's really happening is the motor is not spinning in space. What's actually happening is a camera is spinning around the motor, giving us the impression that the motor is spinning. So each of these diamonds is a different position for the camera in space. So the camera is circling around it, and it's starting a little bit above the motor and finishing at some point in the middle below the motor, and then coming up above the motor again. So this way we get to see the motor at different angles. So it's as simple as that. We've just made an animation, or actually a motion study, that is turning the crank, which is turning the pistons, and at the same time we see the motor spinning in space. But there's one more step we have to do. We need to actually save this as a movie file. Right now it's just a motion study within the SolidWorks environment, so we can't share that with anyone that does not have SolidWorks. So what we do is we go to our little disk icon here, and we are going to save our animation. We'll give this a file name here. This is the default file name, is the same as the assembly name. We're going to save this as a Microsoft AVI file. The renderer is going to be the SolidWorks screen. You can also use PhotoView 360 to do the rendering, but if we do this, it will take an extremely long period of time to actually make the movie, perhaps as much as several hours. Our default is a movie which is going to be 7.5 frames per second. So since this is a 10-second movie, there will be a total of 75 frames in the movie. And the other default is the image size of the movie. Right now it's set at 1265 pixels wide by 301 pixels tall. That happens to be the width and height of this portion of the window. We don't really need all of this window for our movie, so we can always change the aspect ratio by going down here. And I'll change this to like an HD TV format. And we see what it does is it automatically crops out the sides. We can also see I probably should have put the motor a little bit more in the center here. Now the trouble is when I did that, it maintained the 1265 width of the window for the movie, so we're going to have a rendered movie that's going to be 1265 pixels wide, but to maintain this new aspect ratio, it actually had to increase the number of pixels in the height. This is probably going to be a very large movie once it's completed, even though it's only 10 seconds long. So to reduce the size of this movie, I think we can get down to a width of something like 800 pixels, which will reduce this number as well. So I will change this to 800. When I hit the Enter key, we see that that's going to reduce the height also to 450. So 800 to 450 is the same as the ratio of 16:9. Looks like I already made a movie once before and asked if I want to replace it, so I will say yes. Then another pop-up window comes up, and it wants to know what kind of compression I'm going to use on this movie. Compression is used to reduce the total file size of a movie. The better the quality of the compression, the bigger the file size. I'll just leave it at 85 for now, and we will use this Microsoft Video 1 compression. We have some other choices here as well. I will say OK, and it says the motion study results are out of date. Do you want to recalculate them? So we will say yes. It's going to go through and recalculate once here. And at the same time, it should have saved the movie for me. So going to the folder where that movie was saved, I see here my .avi file that was just created a minute ago, and I will double click on this, and we see my movie popping up. We see how the engine is sort of crammed to the side here, so I should have centered it better before making the movie. You can see it spinning in space, and it goes on for 10 seconds. We also see the background is sort of stripy looking. It doesn't have a nicely blended background like the original Solidworks environment, and that probably has something to do with the compression. And that's all there really is to it. You can do multiple motion studies for any assembly. Here we have motion study 1. If we want to do a different type of motion study, maybe we want the crank to turn faster or do some other different things, we can always right-click on the Motion Study tab and say Create New Motion Study, and that will pop up a second tab with a new timeline. So I've tried to keep this first foray into making animations as simple as possible, and maybe in some later videos I will show some additional things we can do to this to make it more interesting.